Maya Johnson stepped into the courtroom with the kind of quiet confidence that came from years of experience navigating spaces where her presence was often unexpected. She adjusted her glasses and glanced around the modest, sparsely populated room. The walls were of faded beige, and the air was thick with the scent of old paper and dust. The sound of a gavel striking echoed as Judge Charles Reynolds called the court to order. His voice was firm, but the kind of firmness that had been shaped over decades of making quick decisions, not always considering the nuance behind each case. Maya's case was no different. At least, that's what Judge Reynolds thought. She had been summoned for a simple traffic violation, failing to properly display her vehicle's registration. A small matter, one that didn't warrant much attention beyond a brief fine and a quick exit. It was the sort of case that Judge Reynolds had handled hundreds of times in his career, and he wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary today. Ms. Johnson, you're here for the citation of improper registration, is that correct? Judge Reynolds asked, not looking up from the paperwork in front of him. Yes, Your Honor, Maya replied evenly, standing tall before him. Her voice was calm, but it carried an unspoken authority that immediately caught his attention. She wasn't nervous like most defendants. She wasn't fidgeting or trying to explain away her mistake. She simply stood there, awaiting her fate. The judge looked at the ticket again, scanning the details. Failure to display registration. A minor infraction, but one that must be addressed. A fine of $150 should suffice. He reached for the gavel, already ready to move on to the next case. But Maya didn't move. She didn't nod in agreement or bow her head in shame. Instead, she cleared her throat softly, and the words that followed made the courtroom fall into an unusual silence. Your Honor, Maya began, her voice steady. I understand the citation, but I believe this fine doesn't reflect the circumstances of my situation. The judge raised an eyebrow, momentarily distracted from the paperwork in front of him. Most people would have pleaded guilty and moved on, but Maya wasn't like most people. She spoke with such composure that it intrigued him. Go on, he said, gesturing for her to continue. Maya paused before replying, choosing her words carefully. I work as an advocate for Indigenous rights at the federal level. I've been involved in cases concerning land protection, environmental justice, and the upholding of treaties. Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, Judge Reynolds simply stared at her. The courtroom felt smaller, and he could feel the shift in the atmosphere. His eyes narrowed slightly. That's commendable, Ms. Johnson, but what does that have to do with your traffic ticket? Maya took a breath and stood a little taller. It means I'm frequently traveling for my work. I've been in meetings across the country and have had to move quickly between obligations. The registration slip was misplaced during one of my recent travels, but I've since corrected the issue. This fine feels a bit disproportionate under the circumstances. Judge Reynolds looked down at her as she spoke, his mind racing to process the sudden information. He had heard of people doing meaningful work, but never had he expected to find himself in the presence of someone whose words suggested she was something far beyond the average defendant. The courtroom seemed to shrink as Maya's words sank in. Judge Reynolds found himself momentarily speechless. It wasn't every day that someone walked into his courtroom and casually revealed their role in something as significant as federal advocacy for Indigenous rights. He glanced at the audience, a handful of people seated in the back, their eyes shifting between him and Maya, curious about the exchange. For a brief moment, the judge struggled to make sense of what Maya had just said. Federal advocate for Indigenous rights. His mind raced through the implications. She didn't look like what he imagined when he thought of someone in such an important position. He had expected a much older, more formal figure, someone whose presence would command attention the moment they entered the room. Instead, Maya stood before him, young, composed, and unapologetically confident. Ms. Johnson, Judge Reynolds said, breaking the silence, his voice more measured now. That's certainly an impressive line of work. But we are here to discuss a traffic ticket, not your professional background. Maya didn't flinch. She knew this was going to be tricky. Most people didn't understand the gravity of what she did, let alone how it intersected with moments like this. But she also knew that justice wasn't always about following rules to the letter. It was about understanding the context, the bigger picture. She needed to make the judge understand that the fine wasn't just a technical issue. It was a part of a much larger system that had often ignored the voices and lives of people like her. "I understand, Your Honor," she replied, keeping her voice steady. "But I'm asking for your consideration, not just because of who I am, but because of the circumstances surrounding this ticket. You see, my work takes me across the country, meeting with tribal leaders, working on legal cases, and fighting to protect their land and their rights. This isn't an excuse. It's just the reality of the work I do. And sometimes, in the rush of it all, things like a misplaced registration slip can happen." The judge shifted in his seat, clearly unsettled by her calm demeanor. "I appreciate what you're saying, Ms. Johnson, but this court has rules, and they must be followed. Everyone here, no matter their profession or background, is held to the same standards." Maya nodded, accepting that response, but there was more she wanted to say. "I'm not asking for special treatment, Your Honor. I'm simply asking for understanding. The work I do is about fighting for the rights of those who've been forgotten or ignored for far too long, many of whom have had their voices silenced by systems of power. I fight for justice, and sometimes I'm forced to make difficult choices in the pursuit of it." The room fell silent again. Judge Reynolds studied her carefully, his earlier irritation now replaced by a creeping sense of uncertainty. He was used to people making excuses, but Maya's words were different. There was a weight behind them that he couldn't dismiss so easily. It wasn't about whether or not the fine should be waived. It was about whether he could truly see the woman before him for what she was, not just as a defendant, but as someone whose role in the world was much more complicated than a minor traffic violation. "Let me make sure I understand," he said slowly, his voice less stern than before. "You're asking me to reconsider the fine based on the nature of your work and the circumstances surrounding this particular situation." Maya's response was simple, but it carried the sincerity of someone who had long known the struggles of balancing personal sacrifice with a greater mission. "Yes, Your Honor. That's all I'm asking." Judge Reynolds leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming thoughtfully on the wooden armrest. The words Maya had spoken were still echoing in his mind, but he wasn't quite ready to make a decision. He had heard plenty of defendants before, each with their own reasons for asking for leniency, but something about Maya's calm, measured explanation unsettled him. She wasn't just another person in front of him asking for mercy. She was someone whose words held a weight that demanded more than a routine response. As the seconds passed, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Maya stood there, unmoving, waiting for him to say something. Anything. Her eyes never wavered, holding his gaze steadily, as though she knew exactly what kind of effect her words were having on him. The judge shifted uncomfortably in his seat, feeling the dissonance between his duty to uphold the law and the sudden realization that he might be missing something much bigger than a simple traffic infraction. He cleared his throat and glanced down at the paperwork again, more out of habit than necessity. "Ms. Johnson," he began, his voice softer than before, "you've given me a lot to think about. I'll admit that. But we can't ignore the facts here. The law is the law, and I've had to enforce it for years without exception." Maya nodded, understanding the weight of his words. "I don't expect you to overlook the law, Your Honor. What I'm asking is for you to take into account the full picture of the situation. Sometimes the law can be rigid, yes, but it's also supposed to serve justice, and justice is about more than just following rules blindly." Judge Reynolds paused, his fingers still tapping against the armrest, but with a new sense of hesitation. Maya's words were challenging him in a way that most defendants' pleas never did. He wasn't sure why, but he felt as if she was asking him to look beyond the legal text and see the human side of things. The question was, could he do that without compromising the fairness he prided himself on? There was a subtle shift in the room as the audience began to notice the change in the judge's demeanor. His usual impassiveness had been replaced by something more contemplative. The air, once thick with the routine of courtroom proceedings, now felt charged with an unspoken tension. No one could have predicted that this simple traffic ticket would lead to a moment of introspection for the judge. But here they were. "I've been in this position for over 30 years," Judge Reynolds continued, his tone less authoritative now, more reflective. "And I've seen all sorts of excuses, all kinds of explanations for why rules should be bent. But there's something about what you're saying that makes me question if there's a different way to approach this, one that considers more than just the legal framework." Maya didn't respond immediately. She could see that the judge was genuinely grappling with something, his mind wrestling with the dilemma she had presented. It wasn't just about the fine anymore. It was about how the law interacted with the realities of people's lives, and how often it failed to see beyond the surface. She was beginning to feel like she wasn't just challenging him as a judge, but as a person who had perhaps never been forced to confront this particular kind of truth. "I understand it's not an easy decision," she said quietly. "I don't expect you to change everything today, but I hope this makes you think about how sometimes the right thing to do isn't always black and white." The judge nodded slowly, his expression now thoughtful. He was no longer simply weighing the ticket in front of him. He was considering something far more profound. The silence in the courtroom grew thicker, as if time itself had slowed. Judge Reynolds sat back in his chair, his fingers now resting on the desk as he looked at Maya with a new kind of curiosity. He had always prided himself on making quick judgments, but this was different. The usual rhythm of his work had been disrupted. He could no longer see Maya as just a person standing before him for a minor infraction. She was a puzzle, an unexpected challenge to everything he had come to accept about justice, fairness, and his role within the legal system. Maya, sensing the shift, decided it was time to clarify just who she was and why this moment mattered. She had already explained her situation, but now she needed to offer something more concrete, a reminder that her work wasn't just a casual statement, but a lifelong commitment to a cause much greater than herself. Slowly, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small envelope, opening it carefully. From it, she extracted a letter. The envelope wasn't flashy. In fact, it looked like the kind of document anyone might forget about in a drawer. But as Maya placed it on the table before the judge, a sense of gravity filled the room. She wasn't just handing over a piece of paper, she was offering him a glimpse into the world she inhabited. Judge Reynolds glanced at the letter, then back at Maya. "What's this?" he asked, his voice laced with uncertainty. It wasn't a dismissive question, but more of a quiet invitation to understand. "This," Maya began, her voice steady but clear, "is a letter of verification from my department. It confirms my position as a senior legal advocate for Indigenous rights. It outlines the cases I'm currently involved in, some of which are of national importance." She watched as Judge Reynolds picked up the letter, his eyes scanning the words quickly. He had expected a brief explanation, but what he was reading wasn't just paperwork, it was a testament to the weight of Maya's work. The letter detailed her involvement in landmark cases related to land preservation, environmental protections, and treaty enforcement. Her name was mentioned in connection with legal victories that had shaped policies for Indigenous communities at the federal level. This wasn't just a career. It was a legacy of advocacy that extended far beyond a courtroom like his. The judge's brow furrowed as he absorbed the information. He had heard of high-profile advocates, of course, but never had he expected to encounter one so unexpectedly in his own courtroom. The disparity between the woman standing before him and the role she held in the legal system became glaringly apparent. "Senior legal advocate," Judge Reynolds murmured under his breath. He looked at Maya again, but this time his gaze was different, more respectful, more thoughtful. I had no idea." Maya nodded. "Few do, Your Honor. But that's the point. My work takes me to many places, fighting for the rights of communities who have been ignored for too long. It's not glamorous or easy, but it's necessary. And sometimes, like today, I find myself in situations where I'm just trying to make sure the system doesn't overlook the small details, like a misplaced registration slip, that could affect the bigger picture. The judge set the letter down, his mind racing. He had no idea how to proceed now. What began as a simple ticket was becoming a moment of profound realization. This wasn't just about a fine. It was about the depth of Maya's work and the quiet strength she held in advocating for those who often went unheard. Judge Reynolds set the letter down slowly, almost reverently. His hands lingered over the surface of the desk, as though he could still feel the weight of the words in front of him. Maya's credentials were undeniable. The cases she was involved in weren't just high profile, they were game changers. Her advocacy work for Indigenous rights stretched far beyond a simple legal career. It was a mission, a crusade, one that influenced national policy and brought about real change for communities long forgotten by the legal system. But it wasn't just the importance of her role that had affected him. It was the way she spoke, the way she carried herself, and the depth of her conviction. She wasn't someone trying to manipulate the system for personal gain. She was someone who had dedicated her life to advocating for those whose voices had been silenced for far too long. And here she was, standing in front of him, not asking for special treatment, but simply requesting that her circumstances be taken into account. For a moment, Judge Reynolds felt a flicker of doubt. He had spent decades in his career believing in the simple, straightforward application of the law. Justice to him had always been a matter of adhering to the rules. There was right, and there was wrong, and his job was to enforce that. But now, as he sat in front of Maya, he was starting to question that very foundation. He had always thought of himself as fair, as someone who delivered justice without bias. But what if the system he had trusted was, in some ways, flawed? What if the law, in its rigidity, failed to see the full picture? Maya wasn't just a defendant. She was a woman with a purpose, with a life that held far more significance than the minor infraction she was being judged for. And here he was, weighing the fate of someone who had spent her career fighting for those whose rights had been trampled by laws just like the one she had violated. The more Judge Reynolds thought about it, the more he realized how much of the world he had been blind to. He had read about the struggles of Indigenous communities, seen headlines and news reports, but he had never had to confront it in such a personal way. Maya had brought him face to face with a truth that he couldn't ignore. She had made him see that the law was not just about adhering to rules. It was about understanding the human experience behind those rules. "I've spent a long time in this job, Ms. Johnson," he said finally, his voice softer than before. "And I've always believed that the law is absolute. That what's written down is what we must follow." Maya nodded, waiting for him to continue. "But you've made me see something I hadn't considered before," he continued, his gaze now fixed on her. "Justice isn't always about rigidly applying the law. Sometimes it's about understanding the reasons behind the rules and considering the broader context. What you've told me, what you've shown me, goes beyond this ticket. It challenges everything I thought I knew about fairness." Maya held his gaze, her expression calm. She hadn't expected this conversation to change the judge's view in an instant, but she knew that in this moment, he was beginning to see things differently. The walls of certainty that had defined his decisions for so long were starting to crack. Judge Reynolds took a deep breath, looking down at the ticket before him. "I need a moment to think," he said, his voice trailing off as he leaned back in his chair, lost in thought. Maya simply nodded, waiting patiently. Whatever the outcome, she knew that this moment had already changed both of them. The silence in the courtroom stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Judge Reynolds sat at his desk, his hands folded in front of him, staring down at the ticket as if it were a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. The weight of his thoughts grew heavier with each passing second. He was no longer just contemplating a traffic violation. He was grappling with the very nature of justice and his role in administering it. The simple act of issuing a fine had become something far more complex. Maya stood in front of him, composed and patient. She knew that this wasn't a moment to rush him. no matter how much she longed for a resolution. She had made her case, and now it was up to him to decide. In her mind, it wasn't just about the fine anymore. It was about forcing a conversation, one that went beyond the walls of this courtroom. After a long pause, Judge Reynolds finally broke the silence. He raised his head and looked directly at Maya, his expression more thoughtful than she had ever seen it. "Ms. Johnson," he began, his voice carrying an air of seriousness, "I've been a judge for over 3 decades. I've heard thousands of cases, simple ones, complicated ones, and everything in between. And in all that time, I've never had a case like this. You've given me much to think about, more than I ever expected to consider when I walked into this courtroom today." Maya met his gaze, waiting for him to continue. She could sense that he was on the verge of making a decision, but there was still a tension in the air. Judge Reynolds stood up from his chair and walked over to the large window behind the bench. He looked out at the street below for a moment, as if seeking clarity in the outside world. Maya didn't say a word, but her thoughts were racing. She knew that this decision was not just about her. It was about how the system saw people like her, and how, perhaps, it could see them differently. He turned back to her, his face softened by something she couldn't quite place. "You've opened my eyes to something, Ms. Johnson. You've reminded me that the law is not always black and white. There's nuance, context, and humanity to consider. And though I've spent my career enforcing the rules, I believe that true justice requires more than just following procedures. It requires understanding." Maya's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected this kind of reflection from him, especially not from someone with his background in law. "I'm going to waive the fine," Judge Reynolds said, his voice firm but measured. "In this case, I believe the circumstances justify it. Your work speaks for itself, and I recognize that a simple ticket like this doesn't reflect the larger picture of your life or your contributions." The words hung in the air, and for a brief moment, Maya felt a wave of relief wash over her. This wasn't just about avoiding a fine. It was a moment of validation, a sign that the system could, at times, step beyond its rigidity. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said, her voice sincere but tempered by a deep sense of respect. She wasn't just grateful for the decision. It was more than that. She had witnessed a shift, both in the judge's thinking and in her own. This wasn't just a legal victory. It was a small step towards something more meaningful. Judge Reynolds nodded, still processing the weight of his decision. "Just know that this doesn't happen often," he added, his tone now tinged with a hint of caution. "But sometimes, when the right context is presented, the law can bend. It's a reminder to me, and to all of us, that we need to see the whole story, not just the rule." As Maya turned to leave the courtroom, she couldn't help but feel that today had been about more than just a ticket. It had been a small but important victory for justice, one that had altered the course of both their lives, if only for a moment. As Maya stepped out of the courtroom, the cool air of the late afternoon seemed to offer a fresh sense of clarity. She hadn't just won the case, she had opened a door, one that Judge Reynolds had clearly stepped through. She couldn't quite explain it, but there was something deeply satisfying in knowing that her words had made him reconsider not just the fine, but the very principles that had guided his decisions for years. The courthouse was still bustling with the usual flurry of activity, but Maya felt oddly disconnected from it. Today had been a reminder that the law, for all its rules and regulations, was not just a cold system. It was made by people, and people could change, adapt, and learn. As she made her way toward the exit, her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a text message from her colleague, Jordan, with whom she had been working on an ongoing case concerning environmental protections for Indigenous land. "Hey, just wanted to check in. How'd your day go?" Maya smiled slightly as she typed her response, her fingers moving swiftly over the screen. "Interesting day. Took a detour into the courtroom for a traffic ticket. But the judge saw things differently, a little surprised by the outcome." Her phone buzzed again almost immediately. "Wait, what? A judge? For a traffic violation? You're not a fan of speeding tickets, are you?" Maya laughed softly under her breath. It felt good to have a conversation that didn't carry the heavy weight of her usual cases, even if she couldn't help but feel that today was part of something much larger than a simple interaction with the law. Not speeding, just a small registration mix-up. But you won't believe the outcome. I'll explain when I'm back at the office. The conversation was lighthearted, but her thoughts were still firmly planted in the courtroom. She couldn't help but wonder if the ripple effect of her interaction with Judge Reynolds would extend beyond this single case. She had spoken to him as an advocate for Indigenous communities, but she had also presented him with a larger question. How often did the system fail to see people like her? The ones whose lives were woven with complexity and purpose, not just black and white legality. It wasn't just about the fine. It was about how society often overlooked the voices of those who fought for justice from the margins. And today, for a brief moment, she had made that voice heard in a place where it had the potential to shift someone's perspective. Back in her car, Maya turned the key in the ignition, and as the engine hummed to life, she reflected on the broader picture. There would always be more battles ahead, more policies to challenge, and more systems to reform. But today, she had done something small but important. She had humanized the law in a way that could change the course of future decisions. As she drove toward her office, she felt a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that she was part of a much larger movement, one where even small victories could spark real change. Maya arrived at her office, the familiar hum of the building's fluorescent lights greeting her as she entered. She had a stack of case files waiting for her, emails to answer, and meetings to attend. But for once, her mind wasn't on the work that lay ahead. Her thoughts kept drifting back to the courtroom, to Judge Reynolds, and the unexpected exchange that had taken place earlier in the day. The fine had been waived, but it was the conversation they'd shared that resonated with her most. Sitting at her desk, Maya couldn't help but reflect on the impact that a simple traffic ticket had made. It wasn't just the fine that was at stake, nor was it just about her personal situation. It was about a shift in perspective, one that had challenged both her and the judge to rethink the relationship between the law and the people it served. She had presented him with a story, a context that went beyond the facts on paper. It was a story that acknowledged the complexity of life, the human element that was often overlooked in legal proceedings. As the hours passed, Maya's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from her boss, Carl, who had heard about the outcome from a colleague. His message was brief, but it carried a tone of genuine curiosity. Just heard about the ticket incident. Hope it all went well. You good? Maya paused for a moment before responding. She didn't want to just tell him that the fine was waived. That wasn't the point. The victory wasn't in avoiding a financial penalty. It was in making a small dent in the rigidity of a system that often overlooked the humanity of those it governed. I'm good, Maya typed back. It went well, but more importantly, I think the judge learned something today. And so did I. Carl's response came a few minutes later. That's what I like to hear. Let's talk more about it when you're in tomorrow. Keep up the good work. She smiled, feeling a warmth in her chest. It wasn't just about her case or her work. It was about the broader implications. She had not only made an impact on one person's perspective, but had also reminded herself of why she did this work in the first place. It wasn't just about fighting legal battles. It was about changing minds, opening hearts, and creating a more just world, one small interaction at a time. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of emails, phone calls, and the usual rush of her responsibilities. But as she wrapped up her work for the day, Maya felt a deep sense of fulfillment. Tomorrow, the fight for Indigenous rights would resume. There were still many battles ahead, but today, for a brief moment, she had made a difference in a way that wasn't about legal jargon or policy. It had been a moment of understanding, of humanity, and of seeing the world through a new lens. As Maya locked up her office and stepped out into the cool night air, she couldn't help but smile. The journey was far from over, but today had been a reminder that sometimes the smallest victories had the power to change the course of a much larger fight. And that, she realized, was what kept her going.